Welcome to this week's episode of Shapes of Grief. I'm Liz Gleeson, and today I'm joined by Mandy Gosling. Mandy, you are so welcome.
Thanks, Liz. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, Mandy and I, just for listeners, Mandy and I met at the inaugural European Grief Conference in Copenhagen last September. And I'm so interested to speak to you about this topic, adults bereaved as children. Because I would see in my own clinical practice, people who come many, many years after a bereavement that they endured as a child, and it's just not integrated yet. So I'm really, really looking forward to tapping into your expertise on the subject, Mandy. But first, there's a reason, as always, why you are in this field of work and why you are so passionate about it. Mandy, take us back, please, to your own personal experience.
So I was bereaved of my mother when I was 9 years old. And that is 50 years in 2 weeks' time. So a long time ago. And I guess, back then, as we know, 50 years ago, compared to today, where there are more conversations about childhood grief, it wasn't really spoken about. And how I felt at the time was, my mother was there one day and not the next. And then life just sort of carried on. And she wasn't spoken about particularly. And grief was not acknowledged as a 9-year-old. So that was my experience as being a bereaved child. And then that wasn't my first bereavement, though. My mum's dad died the year previous, so I was 8, and I do actually remember that. And then I guess all my main family losses were before I was 21. So when I'm an only child, so then when I was 18, my father sold the family home, which the two of us lived in, moved away, and then I went to live with my grandmother, who died when I was 21. So she was kind of that next sort of maternal figure that I had. So by then, yeah, I'd kind of lost all my close family members. So I had different types of losses, but I guess 3 significant bereavements before I was 25.
Yeah, and can I ask you, Mandy, what happened to your mum?
My mum had breast cancer. I didn't know. It's an interesting one. I remember going to the hospital with her, but I didn't know what was happening. So it was like I kind of knew too much, but also didn't know enough in the right way. So I wasn't prepared. I do remember her illness a little bit. And I remember, again, this is a common one for most bereaved children. They know the night or the day it happened. They can usually grab that memory, and I can still grab that memory, 50 years on, like it was yesterday, the sense in which it impacted. And for me, it was in the night. I was taken to an aunt's house, and I literally played for 3 days. I didn't know what had happened. And then a distant family member just told me, Mummy's gone to heaven. And that was about as much as I was told. And then it sort of plays on your mind about what happened, how did it happen? And as a 9-year-old, you don't have that ability to integrate that trauma at that time. It kind of goes underground.
Yeah, and I'm struck, Mandy, by what you said there. You said, I remember my grandfather dying. Does that mean you don't have a lot of memory around your mother's death? Is it hazy?
I remember the night, but I don't remember don't remember much about then the after event, as you would know, Liz. You know, you just go into complete survival mode. I didn't go to her funeral. She wasn't talked about, and I just got on with life. So yeah, I don't have a lot of memory. I don't, you know, I think that's the thing as a bereaved child, and some of the things I see in my daily practice, you know, it's those missing pieces of being able to connect. And I have done some work around that sort of more sensory level stuff, but actual physical memory, no, I don't have that memory.
It's such a tricky one, isn't it? Because how do you process and integrate something that you can't remember?
Yeah.
Yet it has such a profound, it etches on your body and your soul and your attachment and your relationships in such a profound way. Yet there isn't the memory to try and process and organize and
No.
speak about.
No, that's very true.
So Mandy, at what point did you come to the conclusion, maybe I need to revisit my early bereavements? You know, because we tend to have this notion of, oh, well, they were so young, they don't remember.
Yeah.
But it's not just about remembering, it's the impact of the absence of somebody and the continuing absence throughout your childhood. And then all those developmental changes, and still your loss has not been recognized at every developmental stage.
Well, this is true. I mean, if I'm honest, I didn't seek out help for my mum's death. I think you're hurled into this space of getting on with it, or certainly I was, and I guess I still see clients like that now, because it's potentially too risky to talk about it because of, you know, you don't want to upset the remaining parent, or you know, you might not be able to find the words, or you might not have words. You might be a really young person, or you might be at a critical point where you want to still be accepted in your friendship groups that nobody talks about it, and so you just go. So there's lots of different ways in which, you know, it can manifest. How did I come to it? I think when I decided to train as a therapist, but even then, what's really interesting, Liz, is my first 4 years of therapy, I never talked about my mum. So even though I was going into therapy, the box was still shut. There was no way I was going to go into that box. I'd got through life okay. I mean, obviously I'd kind of hurled through it in various ways where there was a bit of damage here and there, you know, and bumps and bruises. But it wasn't until I came to do my own MA research to understand it. And even then it was like, oh, I don't really want to do that. Why would I want to open that box? So I think it's one of those ones where you don't think, and this is a very common thing I see in practice, is people will come to me with relationship difficulties or certain presentations, you know, depression or anxiety, or just not feeling great, or burnout, or things like that. And they don't even understand themselves that it is to do with their early life loss. Because I also didn't. It was like, oh, well, you know, I'm not really good at relationships, or, you know, I'm a bit anxious, or, you know, I don't know how to do that, or you just because you're an adult by then, you just get on with it, because it's like sometimes you actually feel a bit mad. You know, a bit chaotic, a bit not really quite on top form. It's hard to describe, but, you know, whenever I see a client, it's like, oh, there it is. That's where it is. And then you can go through the the steps in which you need to be able to get there, because for a lot of us, we're still in a trauma state. First off.
And it's this Babette Rothschild, is that her name, who wrote the book? I can't remember it. I know Bessel van der Kolk.
Yeah.
So let me just pause and actually look this up so I'm not blubbering. That's how I can find this spot on my recording. Although the mind doesn't remember, we have the work of Babette Rothschild, The Body Remembers, or Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score. It is in there in the body. And
absolutely.
You mentioned there about maybe I do relationships badly, or, you get anxious. And I'm wondering, Mandy, would you be willing to speak about that a little bit? Anyone working in the grief sphere knows the importance of attachment and how it correlates to how we grieve or how we're going to experience loss. And a 9-year-old child to lose who I assume is your primary attachment figure, your mother, is going to significantly impact your attachment figures throughout life.
Completely. And it doesn't, I think well, relationships per se. So yes, you've got romantic relationships, but also there's friendships as well. Or, I mean, I remember when I was in secondary school, seeking out mother attachment figures with my friends' mothers. So I was looking for that sanctuary and safe place. And I was very fortunate that, my own psyche was leading me through the path to try and find these people that were going to nurture me in a way that I needed, and be part of a family and do those things, but not in, because I was an only child and it was just my father at home. So I was fortunate, but then the wounds play out in relationships, and I did an extra year's relationship training just to really underpin it and understand how that manifests. And of course, we use a lot of attachment theory in relationship work because those wounds will come up in the space between you. So I'm an anxious attachment, and I would cling, and fear anybody leaving. And it was probably quite suffocating and distressing, not just for me, because I can physically remember the distress in adult relationships of being unable to have those normal type interactions. It was either all or nothing. I've got to hold on to them, or if they've gone, or they don't want to be with me. There was no middle ground in the balance place. So there's another book, there's the Maxine Harris book, the Loss That Is Forever, which is a really old book, but it has some very interesting thoughts around being a bereaved child and around love and loss, and that love and loss are intrinsically linked in the psyche. We fear that happening at a visceral level. We're not aware of it, and I think by making it aware, we can understand why some of the responses we have happen. It's not that we're going mad, or it's just because that was our experience. The person we loved the most, left.
Yeah.
So it makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think, Mandy, in your professional experience and also your personal experience, is there a way to heal that? Yes. Or can we just simply understand it and be compassionate about it? Or how, in your opinion, do we develop secure attachments when we've grown up with an insecure or an avoidant attachment?
In my personal experience, and also probably what I see professionally, will the wound always be there? Yes, of course, Liz, because you can't erase your history. There will always be, I think we have to remain open to the fact we don't know what is going to impact it until it impacts us. And that's why everybody's individual journey is unique, because you don't know, I don't know what's going to happen next week. I don't know what's going to happen next year. I don't know if there's something still in my inner workings that will just be touched in some way. It's not like it used to be. I think you can heal. I've certainly healed in my relationship today. And I've had to stretch myself as much as I can in my own workings and develop my security for myself, that this heightened traumatic state, wasn't really serving me. And, it's a case of you have to tolerate the intolerable and stretch it so that your mind-body system can see that another reality exists, as opposed to the wounds of the past.
How did you do that, Mandy? What does that mean in practical terms?
Sheer grit and determination at times, being in therapy, developing awareness when my triggers were activated, how I could step back from it and see something different and see that it wasn't the present that was activated, it was the past, the transference. And does it activate now? Yeah, really occasionally. I'd be lying if I said it didn't. But I know it. It's like a friend now. And I go, oh, haven't seen you for a while. Okay, just another layer. I kind of invite it in. I think the more we try and push it away, and of course they are uncomfortable feelings, but the more we push them away, the louder they get, because it's like, please, could you take notice? Please, could you do something? Please, could you integrate this so that a little more peace can exist?
Mandy, if you could summarize how the death of your mother impacted you throughout your life, what would be the key points? How does losing a parent before the age of 10 or 12 or 15, how does that impact a child at the time and throughout the course of their lives?
Well, I don't remember much of my own childhood. So how did it impact me at the time? I think if I were to sum it up in my childhood, it robbed me of my childhood. Because I had to step forward. And of course, every family will be different, but being, it was 1973, and, my father was a man of his time. My mother had taken care of him. And I mean, he could barely boil a kettle. My maternal grandmother was really good. She did a lot for us. But it robbed me of my childhood, where I had to think about more than perhaps I needed to or wanted to.
Become parentified?
Yeah, I think, well, certainly in my case, because there was no other sibling, to share that with. So I think it did rob me of a certain aspect. I think it robbed me of my education. Because my mother was kind of the main person who did that part, and with her not being there, and I met Martin Leet at European Grief Conference, and he sent me some papers afterwards around education and bereaved children and the impact on their educational development. And I wrote back to him when he sent it to him, and I went, I think you just described me in this paper. Because what you're trying to make sure you're doing basic functioning. It's hierarchy of needs, isn't it? Where there's no space for much else apart from I've got to make sure, I get fed, get get clothed, get housed, you know, and do all those basic needs stuff. So the rest kind of go. So that blossoming is minimized to an extent, where you can't, but it doesn't mean to say that it can't come later. I mean, mine just came much later. And I'm forever thankful and grateful for undergoing the journey of therapy in order that I could find myself again, you know, pick that 9-year-old back up.
It's really important, you know, just to focus on what you're saying about losing your education or missing out on your educational development. And just as you've alluded to several times, just the profound loss and how it impacts our brain.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's the amygdala that's activated, isn't it? We go into that survival, fight or flight mode, and the learning part of our brain, the front of it, the prefrontal cortex, is deprived of oxygen and deprived of blood flow. So our ability to concentrate, to memorize, to focus, to learn can be shut down.
Yeah.
And I remember reading a book, I think it was called Life at the Bottom of the Seabed by Lindsay, and I don't remember her second name. But her daughter had been bereaved at age 6, and at age 9, she was still reading like a 6-year-old.
Yeah.
So she had her cognitive development was really impacted in a significant way. And I think this is something that a lot of teachers don't know. And I gave a talk in a school recently, and we were talking about bereaved children. And I was saying, you know, when they're bereaved in first year, you still have a bereaved child in your class in 6th year. You know, that child will always be bereaved and will always need your attention and support and help, and acknowledgement.
And that's kind of where I sit is, yes, you may have a 6-year-old, but you could have a 26-year-old, 36-year-old, 46-year-old, 56-year-old who is still a bereaved child. Just because the outer looks like an adult, the bereaved child still exists within, and particularly when the trauma's not been integrated, or actually they think they should be an adult and they're not functioning like an adult. There is, you know, the kind of notion I take is, you know, yes, see the bereaved child, then see the adult. So how does it last throughout the lifetime, which was what my original research was about, is what is the long-term impact? What does it look like? And since I did that, I finished that in 2016, my knowledge has expanded of what it really does look like. And some of it is not very attractive.
Would you tell us about some of that, Mandy?
So usually what I find is when people come to me, they're sort of in a dysregulated state. So it might be sort of levels of chaos in different ways in relationships, sometimes addictions. So and it's interesting because, you know, when I work with it and people go, oh, I didn't realize it was because, you know, my parent died or my sibling died or whatever, you know, when I was however old. And, you know, that's always been this is why I don't focus on the child per se. I focus on the adult, because for me, that's still a child. There's a child still in distress in an adult body that is unable to say how they feel or understand how they feel or why they feel a certain way. I guess some of the things that present is a lot of anxiety. One, and of course you would give credit to that, you know, because of what happened. But there are other levels of anxiety. So things like health anxiety, that can be quite profound. And then what happens is then it goes into, you know, GP surgeries where people are given medication, you know, because they can't cope. but they're very anxious all the time. And I remember I'm not like it now, to be honest. I'm more anxious about my children being unwell than myself. I think I've reached that point at nearly 60 where I'm not really thinking about me now. I'm thinking about the next generation. Where, that, oh my gosh, I'm going to die, or, my parent died young, so therefore, I'm going to die young. There is, and even if you're not that conscious, it underpins it. And particularly, maybe you have children, and that then becomes more activated, because I don't want my child to experience what I experienced. So health anxiety is quite a one, and of course, then that puts more pressure on other services, and then, well, GPs don't have time to think about somebody presenting with health anxiety, whether they're bereaved or not.
Yeah. Or something that I would come across quite a lot, Mandy, is just having extreme reactions, to goodbyes or breakups, or, where the reaction is, way bigger than the situation warrants.
Oh, the hijack. I call them the hijacks.
Yeah. And it can be so distressing for someone, because you can't help this. It's in your body. It's how you respond. It's out of your conscious control. And people know and want it to be different, but somehow
they can't. They don't. I mean, the system's flooded. From the amygdala, you're unable to land it in any way. You have to ride the storm. I had one. My last one was 2 years ago, Liz. And I guess I thought I was past them. And it's like I say, is you don't know what's going to come in until it comes in. And we've done a house renovation. And I didn't have a kitchen. I didn't have a kitchen for 8 months. And I knew I felt off. And even at the time, even with the work I've done on myself and working in it, I went outside. I couldn't regulate myself. I was discombobulated. I was all over the place. I kept wanting to cry. I didn't know what was happening to me. And it was just off. It was really... I couldn't go. And the following day only lasted a day. And the following day, I thought, oh my gosh, I've been hijacked. What was that about? I was curious, because I'm always curious when those moments come in, so that I can get another kind of layer of integration in it. And it was like, oh my goodness, I know what that was about. And it sounds odd, but anybody who has these will, if you can tie the dots up, it does help you. It was that I was not going to get food, which was my experience as a bereaved child. I did not know how I was going to feed myself some nights. And here I was, as a 58-year-old woman. Of course I could go and feed myself. It wasn't in question, but my mind-body system was questioning it. And so it was hijacked in that moment of, you can't feed yourself, and you must, you're feeling that response of despair and terror. And it's terror. It's absolute terror. And I think that was a very deep one that surfaced, 2 years ago.
It's lovely to hear you just say the amygdala and the flooding, and you've just got to ride the storm. Because I would see a lot of people who would come and say, help me not be like this. Help me fix this. And I will often say, maybe it's more about understanding it and accepting that this is part of us. And like you say, that wound will always be there. And maybe it's developing our compassion. We all know that whatever we resist tends to get bigger,
Yeah.
But
yeah. And I think, then you build the map of yourself, you understand yourself. And I'm not saying you can catch it every time, because that's not humanly possible. We are human, and we have, this automatic nervous system that will do whatever it does whenever it comes in. I mean, the previous time to that was when my granddaughter was born. She's 4 now, where it was watching, it was the most wonderful day of my life, to have my first grandchild. But then my sister was going, how do you do this? And how did you do that when you were a mother, when I was looking at, my daughter? And I think you just have to be prepared that life will throw you the occasional curveball. Is just see if you can hold it long enough so that it can get that transformation. Just hold on to it a little bit, put it in your pocket, carry it with you for a little while and understand it. Because then it loses its intensity. And that is the only way. There isn't really another way. Otherwise,
how did you mother having not been mothered for so much of your life?
I think how did I mother? Badly at times. I'll be
We can all put our hands up to that one.
Of course, badly at times. I'm human after all. I think other people I think my mother was a really good mother. I mean, she had her moments, and I think I often reflect on her. How would I be with her today? She'd probably really irritate me, but we would love each other unconditionally, and I would call that a normal relationship. Going back to my sort of teenage years, I surrounded myself with my friends' mothers who were really maternal. I had my grandmother who was very caring and maternal. I also had some other family members that I learned from. I mean, again, so it's building those learned aspects so that you then internalize, what you would have done, say, from your parents. And I think I was fortunate in that respect. But there were missing pieces. There were definitely missing pieces. And for a lot of adults bereaved as children, there are missing pieces because the role model, isn't there. And whether that's, mum or dad, or whether it doesn't have to be the same sex parent, there will be different aspects to each parent. So certainly in my research, I used archetypes and mythology, and looked at ways in which to develop those aspects which I needed in order to develop my own wholeness. And I think archetypes are really interesting to use for ABCs. I mean, they're interesting to use for everybody we all have missing pieces. It's not just everybody has missing pieces, because you don't get everything you need from your family of origin. So it's like, well, how do I find this? I certainly, when I did my research, my first bit was, okay, I'm going to create a collage of what does a woman look like, and using creative methods. So I created this collage, and that was after I'd done sort of my initial training and my therapeutic work. This was kind of the next level, and I could look at, well, what does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a mother? And now then I had the missing piece of what does it mean to be a grandmother, because I didn't have that either, with my own mother, but I had other people that were grandmothers that I could internalize, or what might that look like? And so you beg the question of, what do I need for the next bit of my journey, so that I can find other ways, because I can't go back in time. I can only go forward, and I would use creative ways of finding those.
I love that idea of using archetypes and finding ways to internalize what you didn't have, that which you didn't have as a child.
Yeah.
And for any therapists who are supporting adults who are bereaved as children, what would be the key messages? Do you believe that there's a specific training people should do, or should they develop awareness around the subject? What's important?
I mean, my goal this year is to make more therapists aware of it, because when I met you at the in Copenhagen, I was sort of asking people, that I was speaking to, what do you do in terms of, say, research, or what services do you have for adults bereaved as children? And actually, it's never been any different when I've asked that. It's like, oh, we don't, but we should, or oh no, we don't. And I think is to develop further conversations about this topic, because we are the lost mourners. There's 2 to 3 generations of us that potentially are walking around in adult bodies still carrying a bereaved child with us. And I would encourage every therapist to ask or understand. And there are things sort of to consider about, yes, there's trauma, but there's also development. There's also the grief, and you can't go to the grief straight off, because you're just going to re-traumatize. So it's very slow, patient work, very slow and patient work, because you're dealing with a very young ego state. So things like inner child work are really beautiful for adults bereaved as children, and normalizing, what they're experiencing, because I think for a lot of us, we feel really out of sorts. We don't really belong anywhere. We don't, as an adult, we're given less tolerance about what we might be carrying and how it presents. I mean, I would say for therapists is to ask the question. One of the interesting things I see is what I call second generation. So their parents would have been bereaved of their parent. And I see that as well, where the parenting style is compromised in some way. And quite often ABCs come to me because they want to parent differently. They may have, part of them may understand. So I work a lot with parenting as well, which I really love. And recently, a very lovely client of mine, I said, oh, she told me a story in session. I said, oh, could you just write me that? And if I want to post it, can I post it? And she said, and her daughter is 6 years old, and she's a really lovely mum. And her mum died when she was 14, and she's, navigating her way through motherhood. But she wanted to undertake therapy, for her own healing, but also so that, the transgenerational material wasn't then kind of continued in terms of trauma events. And she said to her daughter something like, oh, she'd had a hard day at school, you need a mummy cuddle. And her daughter said, because they were now able to have these conversations about death, dying. They were able to have conversations about, her grandmother that wasn't here. And she made her this friendship bracelet, and it just said, remember on it. And she said, oh, that's for you, mummy, when you just want to remember your mummy. And it's like, things like that just melt your heart, that if we talk about it, the next generation then doesn't continue, because there is transgenerational grief, as you would know, Liz.
Yeah, absolutely. And the impact is massive. The impact of losing a parent when you're a child is massive. And it's, it comes back to talking to children about grief at the time as well. And, like you said, we've got a lot better, but we're still not as good as we could be. We have some of the theory. We know it's good to talk to children about it. I'm not sure that that's done in practice. Maybe people handle a loss well at the time of death, but then don't revisit again with the child a few years later, or as they developmentally change.
Yeah. No, I think I would concur with that. I think, we look at how it's handled at the time, and I think, yes, that's a real big step in the right direction. But we don't know what's going to happen with that person. And I would imagine it is quite difficult. I think as a society, we need to understand fully what happens when somebody is bereaved. I mean, even things like partners of someone who's been bereaved, how it might play out. I mean, I was a therapist. I was a training therapist when I met my husband. So he got to really experience it fully and walked with me through that process, and I could help him understand. Once I started to understand myself, I could help him understand why occasionally I did crazy things, that it was my system and I didn't actually have any control over it. It was my stuff, and now, we're many years into our relationship, and he'll go, I think that's your stuff. And I'll go, yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. And that's the key. I mean, I think we'll always have our stuff, but the stuff is such a broad term, and everybody has their stuff or their baggage or whatever you want to call it. But it's about owning it and acknowledging it and taking.
And it's okay. And it's okay. It's giving yourself permission to have stuff. We're human. We have stuff.
And I think when we have those unhealed parts of us, it does propel us into the world, to do good things, or can sort of make us a little bit more empathetic or compassionate. And, we can, our antennae for suffering tends to be good. And we can see when our fellow humans need a hand in the back.
Well, I think that's what propels me now. I mean, I've done a lot of work and healing, and yes, I mean, there will always be more as my life continues. There's always more. It's never the end of the road, and I hope it never is the end of the road, because it means I'm still alive and breathing. But it does propel me, to do the work I do, and because I know what is possible. I know that, trauma can be integrated. We have enough capacity to be able to do that, where we can understand more of our journey, where we can develop conversations with our partners about, why our attachment gets activated, why occasionally we do things that seem a bit odd. And in our families, I think it ripples out so far. I mean, I sometimes see people in work situations where they get activated and think things that you wouldn't think would be activated. It's like someone says, what do you want from this experience? If they're doing, I mean, I've and they would go, well, I'd like my mother to be alive. That's the first thing that comes into their head. It's there, it's present, suddenly somebody says something that just touches the edge of that point where it feels intolerable. So it happens in work, it happens in families, it happens, I think sometimes it creates dysfunction in families. And so then you feel more isolated. Then, then friendships are compromised, because how do I be in friendships? How do I be in relationships? It affects education. And then it's society as a whole. So I'm very much in the place of trying to develop those conversations so people can understand. Yes, childhood grief is really important today, but there's 2 to 3 generations who haven't, because it was of its time, where, I mean, I've had times where people just got told at school and went back to lessons in the afternoon. I mean, that feels like, in today's world, quite barbaric, but that's what happened. And you just only begin to imagine what that must have been like for that child.
Absolutely. I've heard stories of people being called out of class, being told that their mother has died, and then being left to go get the bus home.
Yeah. Oh, no. Sometimes you just go, what did we do? And, I guess I don't have so much involvement with children like in the reality of today, whereas you maybe go into schools. I mean, I don't. But I guess in some sectors of society, it's probably not that much different now, Liz.
Yeah. I think so. I think because we're all still so terrified of grief. I remember my dad as well. Dad died 2 years ago. He was 92, so he'd be 94 now. But as a young boy, his father was in the army and they lived in a barracks, and he remembers getting out of bed one day and pulling open the curtains, and the maid came in and crossly closed the curtains again and reprimanded him, said, "Don't do that, your sister died. Those curtains have to be kept closed."
Yeah.
And that's how he learned his little baby sister had died.
Wow.
It was shocking, absolutely shocking. But like you say, Mandy, there's generations of men and women and who are carrying grief and loss that has never been acknowledged.
Yeah.
And like I say, even now with our children, we think we're doing people a service to not say anything to them if they appear okay, don't want to disturb them, we don't want to upset them. But it's so important to find appropriate times to name the stuff, name the baggage.
Yeah. Yeah.
I would often say to my own kids, how are we all doing here about the separation? They still call it the separation, and I'm separated, divorced now, but separated. How many years? Like coming up 8 or 9 at this stage. But I'm so aware that, my children need constant revisiting of how this impacts them, depending on their developmental age. But it's easy to just leave it be and say, oh, I'll do that another time, or I won't mention it. But I find when I do bring it up, at least one or two of them want to engage and have something to say about it. And I think it's important, if for nothing else, that they know this is a safe house, we can talk about it. Doesn't mean we're doing it well, but that at least it can be spoken about, which I think
that is doing it well, Liz. That is doing it well. There's no magic outcome. Some things you can't make better.
Yeah.
But you can have conversations and to talk about it's because there's almost like a shame that's associated with childhood bereavement, is what I've noticed in my work. Because I don't want to be different. I want to have my friends at school. I don't want to be, known as the mum without a mum when I have a child, or a dad without, somebody present, mum or dad, or either way, really. And so it just goes further and further and further underground. And, through all stages of life, it surfaces. So some of the things I've seen, it surfaces when the child, say you have children, it surfaces when your child reaches the age that you were when your parent died. So there's that. It resurfaces when you may become a parent. It may surface when you choose to not become a parent because you don't ever want your children to feel what you felt. It surfaces, it certainly surfaced for me when I became a grandparent. I definitely wasn't expecting that one, because you think by then it's like it's all kind of sifted through. And will it surface again? Yes, it will surface again. I'm under no illusion that it won't. And I think that's what I mean is about welcoming it in. There's a book, it's Prophecy Cold. It's like the uninvited guest from the unremembered past. And that's kind of what grief is. For me, this is what that book title says it all. It's an uninvited guest. I don't want it, like your clients say. I don't want it. Well, it is an uninvited guest, but it is from an unremembered past. And the way in which, we go on a journey of healing is by remembering, is by being with, is allowing it that space, just as you talk to your children about your separation. You can't fix it, but you can learn to be with it. You can put it in a nice chair beside you and say, well, I don't really want you here right now, but here, have a cup of tea.
Yeah, you're here. It's reminding me of that Rumi poem, The Guest House, every day a new guest. And some of them are lovely and some of them we just don't want, but that's life. There's no such thing as Little House on the Prairie. It is, for many of us, it's a shit show at times. And the sooner we can accept that this being human is tricky. And actually, isn't that the first line of Rumi's poem? This being human is like a guest house.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
Mandy, can you recommend any good resources? That book you mentioned, is it about adults bereaved as children?
no, there's the only ABC one that I have really is the old Maxine Harris. I mean, it's on my to-do list, Liz, but you know, when I'm working, as much as I'm working with people, a lot of stuff gets pushed to the side. But maybe when I retire, I don't know. There are so the way I develop my theoretical working is by drawing on trauma therapy, on child development, and on grief theories. But like we were talking about before, they don't fit exactly. So it is a blended way of working to draw upon the knowledge from those fields and hypothesizing. So I'm doing some research at the moment in the Netherlands, and we are looking at lived experiences of adults bereaved as children. And so, you know, I'm trying to develop the avenues I can develop as best as I can to give a better understanding. I think you need to just draw on all the theories which you think will fit, but let the client guide you, as always, you know, of what they might need. Because, so I will add this in, it's sometimes not just the bereavement that is present for the person. So there will be pre-bereavement, there will be the development of the self pre-bereavement, there will be the trauma of the bereavement, and then there will be the post-bereavement. So, you know, skilled therapists would be able to kind of navigate that dilemma. But it is therapeutic work. It's not a leaflet. It's not it's deep work that is slow and gentle, just as you would do with a child. Even it's like, remember the child inside the adult body. Remember the child that is now the adult. That's the piece. And they will do things that children do.
Yeah, I think, you know, and it's just as you're saying, Mandy, you know, my experience working with people who've been bereaved as a child, maybe 40 or 50 years previously, and they're only just, you know, finding the courage and a way to maybe understand the experience for themselves. But I always find the work of Richard Swartz, Internal Family Systems, to be lovely, you know, where we're cultivating, you know, this adult part of us that does know how to take care of ourselves, you know, because we've done it with our own children, and who can turn then and take care of that very young part when he or she is activated.
Yeah, and I've been reflecting on this over the last few months. So the dual process method, and I think what I notice in relation to that method, and I know a lot of people use that, you know, the restore and loss part, you know, oscillating between the two.
So being with your grief and then having a break from your grief and restoring.
But that doesn't really work for ABCs, because the restorative part is not able to be accessed, really. So we spend a lot of time in the loss part and the trauma part, you know, and even when somebody comes to therapy, you've got to get all those systems, the automatic nervous system, you've got to get the parasympathetic nervous system online to even be able to think about anything beyond that point. I mean, you know, sometimes that's hefty work to get people through that point before you even touch the let's do the healing part of grief.
Yeah.
So it's not grief work per se, it's trauma work, it's child development work, it's internal family systems, it's inner child work. It's a blend dependent on what, because everybody is unique, every single person. I mean, there's flavors of similarity, but they're all absolutely unique. And that's why I'm interested to do this research in the Netherlands, is that, you know, we're doing loads of data, and then, you know, working out from that, maybe there are common themes, but to be able to try and get something published so that people can see the lived experiences. And I think that's what's exciting, is looking at retrospectively how people have managed, because it's very difficult to follow somebody through, so we have to do it retrospectively.
And you know, like you say, everybody's so unique and everybody's circumstances are so unique, but we do also see patterns. And you know, one of the patterns that I would say is, for adults who've been bereaved as children, it's very hard for them to trust anyone else, or trust that the therapist will be good enough, or trust that the therapist will understand, because they've learned at an early age to be independent. And I need to get this done myself.
Oh, that's the best one. We have no vulnerability. I mean, my husband still says to me now, you can ask me to do something. I mean, it doesn't even, again, that's the missing piece. It doesn't even enter our head that we can ask for help, because we've become so self-sufficient. But I mean, you know, that's a great attribute and quality to have, but it's also detrimental, because we might burn out at work, or we have this lack of vulnerability, or we just keep going, and then in relationship we just keep going, and then we get resentful, and then our relationship breaks down, and then we're isolated again. And so you start to see all these unfoldings that are similar.
It's dysfunctional. It's dysfunctional. It's not
really dysfunctional.
We talk about independence like it's a really good thing, but actually humans are interdependent.
Yeah.
We need each other.
Yeah, it's interdependence. Codependency, no. Interdependence, yes, for sure. I mean, that's survival. We need each other to survive. And I think for ABCs, the world doesn't feel safe. Of course it doesn't feel safe. You know, whatever age they were, their whole world collapsed. Why would you feel safe?
Yeah, the worst.
You know, that's the imprint.
Yeah. Well, Mandy, it's been really an eye-opener speaking with you. Thank you so much. And particularly for sharing your own experience in the world. You know, it's just such a richer conversation when people are willing to share their own experience of loss, rather than talk about it from a professional perspective only, because we are all touched by loss and grief. And for anybody listening, I'm sure they've heard some of their own experience in what you have shared today.
Thanks, Liz. It's been a real pleasure to see you again and to share.
Thank you so much. And if you've any good resources, do let me know, so that if you've any good resources, please do let me know, so that I can link to them in the podcast description.
Okay. All right, will do.
Thanks, Mandy.
Thanks, Liz. Bye-bye. Bye.